Sometimes the people who look the smallest in the room are the only ones who remember how to be human. The sentence drifted through Ava Brooks' mind as she adjusted the silver microphone stand near the ballroom stage, careful not to leave fingerprints on the polished chrome. Above her, crystal chandeliers spilled warm golden light across a room worth more money than she could imagine in 10 lifetimes. Men in tailored tuxedos laughed beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Manhattan, while women in glittering dresses carried champagne glasses that cost more than Ava's weekly grocery bill. She kept her eyes low and checked the sound levels again on the small tablet in her hands. She wasn't supposed to be noticed tonight. Temp workers never were. The orchestra near the marble staircase softened into a slow violin arrangement while servers moved carefully between tables lined with white roses and candles. Ava quietly stepped aside as another guest passed her without acknowledgement, but she didn't complain. She needed this shift. Her rent was already 6 days late, and her mother's hospital medication sat in a paper bag on the kitchen counter waiting to be paid for. She touched the tiny blue notebook inside her apron pocket, the one her mother used to write little reminders in before double shifts at St. Vincent's Hospital. Stay kind even when the world forgets your name. Ava had read those words so many times the ink was beginning to fade. Then the ballroom suddenly changed. The giant entrance doors opened, and every conversation softened at once. Richard Whitmore had arrived. The CEO walked in surrounded by executives and investors like the room itself belonged to him. At 6'2", with silver cufflinks flashing beneath the lights and a cold expression carved permanently across his face, Richard carried the kind of power that made people straighten their posture before he even spoke. Employees smiled too quickly around him. Investors laughed harder at his jokes than necessary. He moved through the ballroom like a man inspecting property he already owned. Ava stepped backward near the VIP section to avoid blocking anyone, but before she could turn away, Richard's eyes landed directly on her. His expression tightened almost immediately. Not angry. Worse, dismissive, like seeing her near the stage had interrupted the perfect picture in his head. The music continued softly in the background as he slowed his steps and looked her up and down for less than 2 seconds. "The staff entrance is in the back," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. The words weren't shouted. That made them colder. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Someone near the champagne tower gave a nervous laugh. Ava felt heat crawl into her face as dozens of eyes briefly turned toward her before quickly looking away again. No one defended her. No one challenged him. The silence around her felt heavier than the marble floor beneath her shoes. She lowered her eyes, nodded once, and quietly moved aside without saying a word. Richard had already turned away before she finished stepping back, dismissing her existence as easily as brushing dust from a jacket sleeve. But near the ballroom entrance, an older server carrying a silver tray suddenly stumbled, his hand trembling hard enough for crystal glasses to rattle against each other. And while the wealthy guests instinctively stepped backward to protect their expensive shoes from the falling drinks, Ava was already moving toward him. Ava dropped to her knees beside the older server just before the silver tray slipped from his shaking hands. Crystal glasses rattled across the marble floor, and cold champagne splashed against the polished tiles near her sneakers. The orchestra stopped playing mid-note. For a moment, nobody moved. Expensive shoes stepped backward instead of forward. Guests whispered behind raised glasses while the old man struggled to catch his breath beneath the bright ballroom lights. Ava gently steadied his shoulders before the tray could hit the ground completely. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked softly. Her voice barely rose above the silence surrounding them. The man blinked slowly, disoriented, one trembling hand clutching the sleeve of his black server jacket. Ava noticed immediately how pale he looked beneath the warm golden lights hanging overhead. She glanced around quickly. "Can someone please call medical downstairs?" she asked. A few people looked at each other, uncertain whether they should step in or stay invisible. Richard Whitmore turned sharply from across the ballroom, irritation flashing across his face the moment he saw the scene unfolding near the VIP tables. The perfect rhythm of the evening had been interrupted. Investors from Chicago and San Francisco stood frozen beside the stage while several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Richard walked toward Ava with controlled frustration hidden behind a tight smile. "What is happening here?" he asked coldly. Ava looked up without standing. I think he is having trouble breathing. Richard barely acknowledged the older man. His attention stayed fixed on Ava kneeling on the marble floor in front of everyone important to him. The violinists near the staircase lowered their instruments awkwardly while nearby guests pretended not to stare. Richard adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket before speaking again. Security will handle this, he said. You need to step away. Ava hesitated when she noticed the old server's hand trembling harder against her wrist. His breathing sounded shallow now. The ballroom suddenly felt colder despite the heat from the chandeliers overhead. He asked for water, Ava said quietly. He should not be alone right now. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose, the kind of controlled patience powerful men used when they were trying not to appear angry in public. You were hired to stay in your assigned area, he replied. Not create scenes in the middle of my event. The words landed heavily in the silence surrounding them. Ava lowered her eyes for a second, but she did not move away from the older man. Around them, hundreds of tiny reflections from the chandeliers shimmered across the marble floor like broken pieces of light. Somewhere near the back wall, a waiter quietly set down a tray because his hands had started shaking too. Ava reached for a folded linen napkin and gently placed it beneath the old man's head so he could breathe easier against the hard floor. Her movements stayed calm, careful, almost invisible. She was not trying to embarrass anyone. She was simply trying to help. Richard glanced around the ballroom and noticed investors watching the situation unfold. The discomfort on his face deepened. Get her out of here, he said quietly to one of the security guards standing nearby. The guard hesitated. Ava looked up at him, surprised not by the order itself, but by how quickly everyone seemed willing to let kindness become a problem. Then something unexpected happened. The older server slowly tightened his grip around Ava's hand before opening his eyes fully for the first time. His voice came out rough and low, but clear enough for the nearest tables to hear. Do not send her away, he whispered. The room grew still again. One executive near the front suddenly lost color in his face. Another guest lowered his champagne glass halfway. And across the ballroom, someone quietly murmured a name that made the entire atmosphere change in an instant. Wait, that is Leonard Hale. The name moved through the ballroom like a cold wind sliding under a locked door. Leonard Hale. Conversation stopped almost instantly. One investor near the stage straightened so fast his chair scraped against the marble floor. Another executive lowered his phone slowly, staring at the older server kneeling beside Ava as though his mind could not accept what his eyes were seeing. Richard Whitmore's expression changed for the first time that night. Not anger, not annoyance. Fear. Small, controlled, carefully hidden fear. Ava looked around in confusion as the atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted completely. Moments earlier, people had treated the older man like part of the background. Just another server carrying silver trays between wealthy strangers. But now faces drained of color. Men who managed billion-dollar companies suddenly stood frozen in silence beneath the golden chandelier light. Ava glanced back down at Leonard. His breathing had steadied slightly, though one hand still pressed weakly against his chest. You should stay seated for a minute, she said softly. Leonard looked at her with tired eyes that seemed far older than the expensive ballroom surrounding them. There was kindness in his expression now. Gratitude, too. You stayed, he whispered. Ava gave a small shrug. Someone needed to. Nearby, Richard quickly adjusted his jacket and stepped forward, his polished voice returning almost instantly. Mr. Hale, he said carefully, forcing a composed smile. We had no idea you were here personally tonight. Leonard slowly lifted his eyes toward him, but did not answer immediately. The silence stretched uncomfortably across the room. Somewhere near the back wall, ice clinked softly inside untouched glasses. Rain tapped lightly against the massive windows overlooking the city skyline 30 floors below. Richard tried again. We would have arranged proper accommodations if we had known. Leonard finally spoke, his voice rough but steady. That is exactly why I did not tell anyone. The words landed harder than shouting. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. Ava could feel tension tightening through the ballroom like invisible wire. She carefully helped Leonard sit straighter against the base of the champagne table while security guards awkwardly stepped back, suddenly unsure where they were supposed to stand. Leonard looked around the room slowly, taking in the tuxedos, diamonds, polished shoes, and nervous faces surrounding him. Interesting evening, he murmured quietly. No one laughed. Richard's smile had faded now. Sir, perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private. Leonard ignored the suggestion completely. Instead, his attention returned to Ava. What is your name, he asked. Ava Brooks. How long have you worked here, Ava? Tonight is actually my first shift. A few guests looked visibly uncomfortable hearing that answer. Leonard nodded slowly, absorbing the information. First night here, he repeated. And still the only person in this room willing to kneel on a marble floor to help somebody everyone else stepped around. The sentence settled heavily over the crowd. Ava lowered her eyes, suddenly aware of how many people were staring at her now. Not dismissing her anymore. Studying her. Remembering her. Richard opened his mouth carefully, trying to regain control of the evening before it. Slipped completely from his hands. Mr. Hale, I assure you, everyone here was concerned about your condition. Leonard looked directly at him then. Calm. Sharp. Unblinking. Concerned, he asked softly. No. They were concerned about the carpet. A quiet wave of shame moved across several faces near the front tables. Nobody defended themselves. Nobody disagreed. The orchestra remained silent near the staircase while rain continued streaking softly across the tall windows behind them. And for the first time all night, Richard Whitmore looked like the smallest man in the room. The ballroom no longer sounded the same after Leonard Hale spoke. The soft violin music that had once floated elegantly through the room now felt distant and uncomfortable, like something trying too hard to cover silence nobody knew how to fix. Ava slowly stood from the marble floor, smoothing the wrinkles from her black uniform apron while guests continued staring at her with expressions she could not fully understand. An hour earlier, most of them would not have remembered her face. Now nobody seemed able to look away. Leonard remained seated beside the champagne table, calmer now, one hand resting against the silver chair Ava had helped bring over for him. The harsh color had faded from his face, though exhaustion still lingered in his eyes. Richard Whitmore stood a few feet away, trapped between embarrassment and calculation. Ava could almost see him trying to rebuild control inside his mind. He had spent years mastering rooms like this one. Wealthy rooms. Powerful rooms. Rooms where perception mattered more than truth. But tonight, truth had entered the ballroom wearing a server's uniform and carrying trembling hands. Richard forced another measured smile toward Leonard. Sir, perhaps we should continue this discussion upstairs where it is quieter. Leonard looked around the ballroom again before answering. No, he said softly. I think everyone here should hear this. The room became still enough for Ava to hear rain tapping gently against the giant glass windows overlooking Manhattan. Outside, yellow taxi lights blurred across wet streets nearly 30 floors below. Inside, nobody touched their drinks anymore. Leonard lifted his gaze toward the guests standing around him. Do you know why I came tonight dressed like this? He asked. Nobody answered. Because I wanted to see how people behave when they believe nobody important is watching. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. One woman near the stage lowered her eyes into her champagne glass. Leonard continued calmly. And what I saw tonight was disappointing. Richard stepped forward carefully. With all respect, sir, this misunderstanding does not represent our company values. Leonard looked directly at him. No. The single word cut sharper than anger. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. This young woman was helping, Leonard continued. But the first instinct in this room was not compassion. It was removal. Ava felt heat rise quietly into her face again. She wished suddenly that everyone would stop looking at her. She had not helped the old man to become the center of attention. She had only reacted the way her mother raised her to react whenever somebody needed help. Leonard noticed her discomfort immediately. You look nervous, he said gently. Ava gave a small, uncertain smile. I am not used to rooms like this. A few guests shifted awkwardly at the honesty in her voice. Leonard nodded slowly. Maybe rooms like this are the problem. The sentence settled over the ballroom with quiet force. Richard inhaled slowly before turning toward Ava for the first time without dismissal in his expression. Miss Brooks, he said carefully. I may have spoken too quickly earlier. Ava looked at him but stayed silent. Richard continued, his voice polished but strained beneath the surface. Tonight has been stressful for everyone involved. Leonard's eyes narrowed slightly. Stress reveals character, Richard, he said quietly. Not excuses. Nobody moved after that. The chandeliers continued glowing above them. warm and beautiful, while the atmosphere beneath them felt painfully exposed. Ava glanced toward the orchestra near the staircase and noticed the musicians sitting motionless beside their instruments, waiting for permission to continue pretending the night had not changed. But the night had changed. The room had changed. And somewhere deep beneath Richard Whitmore's carefully controlled expression, something fragile had begun to crack. The air inside the ballroom felt heavier now, as if every chandelier above them had turned into a spotlight, exposing something nobody wanted to admit. Richard Whitmore stood motionless beside the VIP tables, one hand tightening subtly around the stem of his untouched champagne glass, while Leonard Hale's words continued hanging in the silence around him. Investors who had spent the evening praising Richard's leadership suddenly avoided direct eye contact. Executives shifted awkwardly near the stage, pretending to check phones that had gone dark minutes ago. Nobody knew where to look anymore. Ava felt completely out of place, standing in the middle of it all. The black apron tied around her waist suddenly felt too visible beneath the gold light pouring across the marble floor. She glanced toward the service hallway behind the ballroom, quietly wishing she could disappear back into the invisible world she belonged to an hour ago. But Leonard's calm voice stopped her before she could move. "Stay a moment," he said gently. Ava hesitated, then nodded once. Richard forced a slow breath through his nose before carefully stepping forward again. "Mr. Hale," he began, "our company has always valued integrity and inclusion." Leonard raised an eyebrow slightly. "Inclusion?" he repeated softly. The single word made Richard pause. Around them, the room remained painfully quiet except for rain brushing against the windows high above the city streets. Leonard slowly stood from the chair with Ava's help. Several executives rushed forward instinctively, but Leonard waved them back. His eyes never left Richard. "You know what interested me most tonight?" Leonard asked. Richard remained silent. "It was not the disrespect," Leonard continued. "Power has always produced arrogance. That part is old." He glanced around the ballroom slowly. "What disturbed me was how quickly everyone accepted it." Nobody spoke. Ava lowered her eyes toward the floor, hearing the quiet truth in his voice settle across the room like weight pressing. Against every polished table and expensive suit, Leonard turned slightly toward the crowd. Hundreds of successful people watched a young woman get humiliated for simply existing in the wrong place. A woman near the front visibly swallowed hard. Another guest quietly set down his drink. Leonard continued calmly. "And when someone needed help, most of you stepped backward." Richard's jaw tightened again. "I think tonight is becoming unnecessarily personal," he said carefully. Leonard looked directly at him. "Human decency is always personal." The sentence landed harder than any public accusation could have. Ava noticed one of the younger employees standing near the back lower his head completely, shame written plainly across his face. For the first time all evening, the room no longer felt divided by wealth or status. It felt divided by conscience. Richard attempted one final recovery. "Miss Brooks," he said, turning toward Ava with controlled politeness, "if my earlier comment offended you, then I apologize." The words sounded practiced. Safe. Corporate. Ava looked at him quietly for several seconds before answering. "You did not offend me," she said softly. Richard blinked slightly, surprised. Ava held her composure even as dozens of eyes remained fixed on her. "You embarrassed yourself." The ballroom fell completely silent. No anger existed in her voice. No revenge. Just honesty. Pure and calm. Leonard slowly smiled for the first time that evening. Several guests looked visibly shaken by how gently she had spoken the truth Richard could not escape. The rain outside intensified against the tall windows, streaking the Manhattan skyline in silver lines of light. And standing there beneath the chandeliers, surrounded by millions of dollars and powerful names, Ava Brooks somehow looked like the only person in the room who had nothing to hide. No one spoke after Ava's words settled into the ballroom. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt honest. Heavy crystal chandeliers continued glowing above the guests, but now their warm golden light exposed every uncomfortable expression in the room. Richard Whitmore stood perfectly still, his polished confidence slowly unraveling beneath hundreds of quiet eyes. For years, people had nodded when he spoke, laughed when he expected laughter, and looked away whenever his arrogance crossed the line into cruelty. Tonight was different. Tonight nobody looked away. Ava felt suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the last several minutes began fading from her body, leaving only the ache of embarrassment and the strange loneliness that comes after being seen too clearly. She slipped one hand into her apron pocket and touched the little blue notebook her mother had given her years ago. The edges were worn soft now from being carried every day. Rain rolled gently down the massive windows surrounding the ballroom, blurring the Manhattan skyline into silver and gold streaks of light. Somewhere outside, distant sirens echoed faintly through the city below, but inside the room everything remained painfully quiet. Leonard Hale slowly walked toward the tall windows overlooking the rain-soaked streets beneath them. Ava instinctively stepped aside to give him space, but Leonard paused before passing her. "You remind me of somebody," he said softly. Ava looked surprised. "Who?" Leonard smiled faintly, sadness touching the corners of his face. "The version of myself I lost a long time ago." The answer lingered between them quietly. Richard remained near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by executives who no longer seemed certain whether they should stand beside him or create distance from him. One younger employee finally lowered his champagne glass completely and walked toward Ava. His expensive dress shoes clicked softly across the marble floor. "I should have helped," he admitted quietly without meeting her eyes. Ava looked at him for a moment before giving a small nod. "You still can," she said gently. The young employee glanced toward the older servers standing nervously near the back wall. Without another word, he walked over and began helping clean the shattered glasses nobody important had bothered touching earlier. The simple action changed something inside the room. A woman near the stage quietly removed her heels and carried folded napkins toward the spill beside the champagne table. Another guest helped move chairs aside so the older staff members could breathe easier. One by one, tiny acts of humanity began replacing the frozen discomfort that had filled the ballroom all evening. Ava watched silently, almost confused by it. Not because people were helping now, but because it had taken shame for them to remember how. Leonard noticed the same thing. "Amazing," he murmured quietly beside the window. "People spend their whole lives chasing power when what they really want is permission to be decent." Rain tapped softly against the glass beside him. Richard finally stepped forward again, but his voice sounded different now. Smaller somehow. "Miss Brooks," he said carefully, "I owe you more than an apology." Ava turned toward him slowly. The room watched without breathing. Richard struggled for words that probably had never mattered much to him before tonight. "I built this company believing respect came from control," he admitted quietly. "Maybe I forgot what respect actually looks like." Ava studied him silently. The ballroom lights reflected softly against her dark eyes while the city shimmered behind the rain-covered windows. Then she answered in the gentlest voice anyone had heard all evening. "People can feel when you look through them," she said. Richard lowered his eyes for the first time that night. Not defeated, not humiliated, just finally aware. And somewhere in the silence that followed, beneath the soft rain and the fading sound of distant traffic below Manhattan, the room itself seemed to exhale. The ballroom remained quiet long after Ava's words faded into the soft rain tapping against the windows. Nobody rushed back to networking conversations. Nobody returned to rehearsed smiles or business deals worth millions of dollars. Something more important had interrupted the evening, and every person in the room could feel it. Leonard Hale stood beside the towering glass windows with Manhattan glowing behind him in blurred ribbons of gold and white light. His reflection mixed with the city skyline while he watched the room carefully, as though measuring not wealth or influence, but character. Ava stayed near the edge of the ballroom now, trying once again to become invisible. She picked up a folded linen napkin from one of the nearby tables and quietly began helping the older staff members finish cleaning the spilled champagne nobody important had touched earlier. Her movements were calm and natural, like kindness did not require attention to exist. Several guests noticed immediately. One executive slowly removed his expensive tuxedo jacket and rolled up his sleeves before kneeling beside a server nearly twice his age to help gather broken glass. Another guest carried fresh towels from the service station without being asked. Tiny acts, quiet acts, but each one seemed to crack something open inside the room. Richard Whitmore watched all of it in silence. He had spent years building a company obsessed with performance, precision, image, and control. Yet somehow the most powerful moment of the entire evening had come from a young woman with no title, no status, and no desire to impress anyone. The realization unsettled him more deeply than public embarrassment ever could. Leonard finally turned away from the windows and looked directly toward the crowd gathered near the center of the ballroom. "I have funded companies for over 40 years, he said calmly. "Do you know the first thing I look for before investing?" Nobody answered. Leonard glanced toward Ava. How people treat someone who cannot benefit them. The room grew still again. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. Several executives looked visibly ashamed now, no longer hiding behind polite expressions. Leonard continued quietly. "Tonight, one person passed that test." Ava stopped folding the towel in her hands. "Sir, I really did not do anything special," she said softly. Leonard smiled faintly. That is exactly why it mattered. Rain rolled slowly down the windows behind him, while the city lights shimmered through the glass like reflections floating underwater. The orchestra remained silent near the staircase, their untouched instruments resting beneath soft amber light. Leonard walked slowly toward Ava until he stood only a few feet away from her. "Young lady," he said gently, "do you know how rare it is to find somebody who keeps their humanity after being humiliated?" Ava looked down for a second before answering honestly. "My mother always said kindness is expensive for people who have suffered." Leonard nodded quietly, deeply affected by the answer. Richard looked at Ava then with an expression nobody in the ballroom had ever seen on his face before. Not superiority, not irritation. Respect. Real respect. The kind that cannot be demanded or purchased. One by one, people throughout the ballroom slowly began standing from their seats. No announcement was made. No music played. There was no applause at first. Just silence and movement. Investors, executives, servers, assistants, musicians. They rose quietly, turning toward Ava as if acknowledging something much larger than a single moment. Ava's eyes widened slightly in confusion. "What are they doing?" she whispered. Leonard's voice softened almost into emotion. "They are standing because somewhere tonight, they remembered what dignity looks like." Then the first clap echoed softly through the ballroom. Another followed. Then another. Until the entire room filled with applause that felt less like celebration and more like repentance. The applause continued rolling through the ballroom like distant thunder, steady and emotional, echoing beneath the crystal chandeliers while rain streaked softly across the towering windows behind them. Ava stood frozen near the champagne table, overwhelmed by the sight of hundreds of people rising to their feet around her. Some clapped quietly with lowered eyes. Others looked directly at her with visible regret written across their faces. It did not feel like celebration. It felt like confession. Ava glanced down at her hands, still damp from cleaning spilled champagne from the marble floor only minutes earlier. She had never imagined standing in the center of a room like this. Not because she dreamed of attention, but because rooms like this rarely noticed people like her unless they needed something carried away. Leonard Hale watched the crowd carefully, emotion softening his tired eyes. "Do you see it?" he asked quietly. Ava looked confused. "See what?" Leonard nodded. Toward the people surrounding them. "They are not standing because you impressed them," he said gently. "They are standing because you reminded them who they used to be before money taught them to look away." The words settled deep into the silence between the applause. Across the ballroom, Richard Whitmore slowly loosened the tension in his shoulders for the first time all night. He looked around at the executives beside him, the investors near the stage, the servers standing awkwardly against the back wall, and finally at Ava herself. The young woman he had dismissed less than an hour earlier now carried more dignity and silence than he had managed with power all evening. Richard stepped forward slowly through the crowd. Nobody stopped clapping, but the room watched him carefully now. Every polished shoe against the marble floor seemed louder in the silence beneath the applause. When he finally reached Ava, he stopped several feet away instead of towering over her the way he had earlier. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly. Ava looked up at him calmly. Richard hesitated before speaking again, as though the next sentence cost him more than any business negotiation he had ever faced. "I spent so many years trying to become important that I forgot how to become decent." The room fell softer around them. Leonard remained silent near the windows, allowing the moment to belong entirely to Ava now. Richard continued carefully. "What I said to you earlier was cruel. Not because of stress. Not because of pressure. Because somewhere along the way, I started believing certain people mattered more than others. Ava listened without anger in her expression, only tired honesty. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. And tonight, you exposed that in front of everyone. A long silence passed between them while rain shimmered against the Manhattan skyline behind the ballroom windows. Finally, Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the gold executive access badge hanging from a black silk lanyard around his neck. The same badge nobody in the company could enter the upper floors without. He looked at it quietly for a moment before holding it toward Ava. Tomorrow morning, he said softly, I want you upstairs on the executive floor. Not as staff, as part of this company. Several executives looked visibly stunned. Ava stared at the badge but did not reach for it. Why? She asked gently. Richard's answer came almost as a whisper. Because if someone like you does not belong in that room, he said, then none of us ever deserve to be there. The applause slowly faded into silence again, but this time the silence felt warm, human. And beneath the golden chandelier light, surrounded by wealth, power, and humbled faces, Ava Brooks quietly shook her head and gave the badge back. The ballroom grew quiet again after Ava handed the gold badge back to Richard Whitmore. No one expected her to refuse it. Several executives exchanged stunned glances while the soft rain continued sliding down the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. The city lights outside shimmered across the glass in blurred rivers of white and gold, but inside the ballroom, all attention remained fixed on the young woman standing calmly beneath the chandeliers. Richard looked down at the badge resting in his own hand, as though it suddenly weighed far more than polished metal should. Ava gave him a small, respectful smile. I appreciate it, she said gently. But kindness should not need a promotion to matter. The sentence settled quietly across the room. Leonard Hale closed his eyes for a brief moment, almost as if the words carried a truth he had spent years searching for in boardrooms and contracts and billion-dollar meetings. Richard slowly nodded, absorbing every syllable. For the first time in his career, nobody in the room cared about his status, his company, or his money. They cared whether he understood what had happened tonight. Ava stepped backward slightly, adjusting the sleeve of her simple black uniform. My mother cleans hospital rooms overnight, she continued softly. She always told me that people reveal themselves most clearly when they think someone beneath them is watching. Richard lowered his eyes again. Around them, the ballroom no longer felt divided between executives and staff. Servers stood beside investors. Assistants spoke quietly, with musicians near the staircase. The invisible walls that usually separated people by wealth and importance seemed thinner now,